Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, and welcome to this, our final meeting of the Bruges Group in 2016. And who better to have as a speaker on this occasion than the great historian and biographer Andrew Roberts. What a wonderful year it has been. But we are not finished yet. We are not finished yet on the journey that Margaret Thatcher set us upon some 27 years ago at Bruges. There is much to be done to make our country once again a truly independent sovereign state. Let me particularly welcome those of you that are here tonight who are of that special group, the Maastricht Rebels. These were the men and women that voted in that crucial division in Parliament some 24 years ago to check the advance of European government and to derail the disastrous decision to establish European monetary union. Maastricht was the Rubicon, and once it was crossed, treaty followed treaty to enhance and extend the powers of the European state. The provisions of Maastricht have impoverished millions of people and played a major part in causing the mass movement of people across national borders. How right we were. Now in 2016, it is the people that have decided that their country should be liberated from the powers of the European state. And that once again, Britain should be a truly sovereign state. But to implement that decision, much more, and indeed everything, remains to be done. Our government faces the most challenging agenda that any has faced since 1940. Let me be quite clear. The European Union, as we enter 2017, is not a safe place to be. It is in our best interest that our country should be released from the burdens and onerous obligations of EU membership with as much speed as possible. While we remain, our borders lie entirely open. We have to make onerous financial contributions. We have to maintain high tariff barriers against cheaper products from across the world. We cannot enter into any free trade agreements with any other country. And in the event of the breakup of the Eurozone, and that is quite possible, further onerous financial obligations will be triggered for the United Kingdom. We must approach this task with confidence and remember the words of Churchill when he said that when there was a choice between Europe and the open sea, we must choose the open sea. Churchill was a great free trader. He understood that Britain had become the most powerful country in the world, largely through the instrument of global trade. Global trade is still the powerhouse of British prosperity. not our membership of a European customs union that has largely benefited our European neighbours. Brexit is the greatest opportunity for growth and success in our country that will occur in our lifetime. If you want more details of these opportunities, read the speech that the brilliant Peter Lilly made to the Bruges group last month, which was kindly summarised by the Sunday Times some 10 days ago. Now, turning to our guest speaker, Andrew Roberts has produced a most fascinating book, many fascinating books, but one in particular, which is appropriate to the crisis we face now, was Eminent Churchillians. And he has a chapter in that book entitled The Tories versus Churchill. Hard as it is to imagine, while the Battle of Britain raged and beyond, many Tory appeasers continued their criticisms of Churchill. Today, for appeasers, read Remainers. Or as some like to call them, Remoners. Our government must, in a timely fashion, implement the decision of the British people to leave the European Union. They must deal effectively with the Remainers, whether they be Supreme Court judges, former Prime Ministers, members of the House of Lords, or just Tory, Labour and Lib Dem politicians who put their loyalty to the European Union first. It's even being suggested that our Supreme Court may refer the matters that it is now considering to the European Court. That's right, the European Court. The government needs to be prepared to bring forward simple legislation before Parliament to abolish the supremacy of the European Court. Article 50 provides for protracted and maybe inconclusive negotiations. If necessary, these should be short-circuited by Parliament repealing the relevant European legislation. If there is not a majority in Parliament for implementing the referendum decision in a timely fashion, a general election can be called. Those parliamentarians who wish to remain in the European Union in some form or other can seek re-election in their true colours. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in historic times, and many of the certainties that have set the framework for post-war politics in the West are now being called into question. Tonight, we are privileged indeed to have as our guest the great historian and biographer Andrew Roberts. And could I just for a moment pay tribute to all the work that Andrew did during the referendum campaign. Constantly appearing on the media and writing columns on this issue. And it's not easy to get attention with the sort of media that we have. But Andrew did an absolutely sterling job. Now, as you know, Andrew is a distinguished historian and biographer. But he's also produced one work of fiction that some of you may have come across. And that is a novel called The Aachen Memorandum. And he wrote this in 1995. And he actually envisaged that there would be a referendum in 2015. Yes, this is a great man. Now, I know this embarrasses him somewhat, because he got the result slightly wrong. He thought it would be 51% for Remain against 49% for Leave. But my God, he was.
No, sorry, that's not right.
It's not right.
No. In the book, I predicted it would be 51.89% for Leave. in fact, it was 51.86%. So I was 0.03 of 1%.
Well, that is even more remarkable. If this man ever has writer's block, he can take over a number of polling companies, and he will be the star of the polling world. And the other thing that he got right was the type of campaign that the Remainers would fight. He said it would be a campaign with leaders of the business sector to the fore that predicted that mass unemployment would occur in the event of a no vote, and that the chattering classes would endorse the Yes campaign en masse. How right he was. He even got the numbers more or less right for the northeast of England. He said in the northeast they would vote 56% to 44% to Leave. But he knew also that the London region would be overwhelmingly in favour of Remain. Remarkable predictions, Andrew. We are greatly indebted to that. Fortunately, I think that George Osborne may have been one of the fans of this book, because he thought, my God, this is the way to win. That this is Project Fear, exactly what you set out in your book. George Osborne adopted Project Fear. But unfortunately, not even George's skills could change the result. But tonight, we will not hear from Andrew Roberts, the fiction writer, but the Andrew Roberts that we all admire, the great biographer and military historian. His literary career began with a much acclaimed biography of Halifax, The Holy Fox. This was followed by Salisbury, Victorian Titan, and then a whole series of award-winning military and biographical works: Wellington and Napoleon, Hitler and Churchill, Napoleon the Great, works that have reached a wider audience through the medium of television. Andrew also holds the position of visiting professor of war studies at King's College, London. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please give the warmest of welcomes to Andrew Roberts.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you this evening, and thank you very much indeed, Barry, for those tremendously kind words. I actually thought when I was coming here how nice it is not to have a book to sell. And now you've mentioned a book that I did write a long time ago, which I don't really urge you to read. It was written as a jeu d'esprit, really. Although Jonathan Aitken did tell me that one of the sex scenes left him aroused. So you're able to arouse Jonathan Aitken with a sex scene. I'm pretty proud of that. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that on the 23rd of June 2116, which is a Friday, by the way, the British people are going to celebrate the centenary of what we have done here, what 17,410,782 Britons did this year. I think there will be great celebrations. I think there will be dinners in wonderful old clubs like this one. There will be speeches. There will be, if there's such things as newspapers still in 100 years' time, there will be articles praising the people who came together and voted in this truly extraordinary way, in a way that was not predicted by anybody, that the entire establishment, as Barry said, the entire establishment, not just the British establishment, but the global establishment, came together to try to stop the British people from having their freedom again. And they failed. And that says something. It says something about so many of the British people. And it also says something about the global establishment, the sheer defeatism that one sees right across the establishment of this country leads me to believe that there is something terribly, terribly wrong, something terribly rotten in our leadership. In my profession, we had a letter to the Times written by no fewer than 300, or at least signed by 300 historians, saying that Britain was going to be cast adrift. Against that, there were 5 historians, David Starkey and Robert Toombs, a couple of others, and me, signed a letter saying the exact opposite. Well, what's happened? Do we really see a nation that's cast adrift? Does Nissan think that we've been cast adrift when it decides to build 2 extra new models in Sunderland, that wonderful city of Sunderland, ladies and gentlemen? Does Facebook, a great global company, think that we've been cast adrift when it decides that it's going to open a huge new set of offices here? The massive inward investment that we've seen since Brexit, would that have been happening, ladies and gentlemen, if the international business community genuinely thought that we had been cast adrift? It's the exact opposite, if anything. And one sees also this sense of self-hatred amongst our governing classes. We also see that in academia. There's this marvellous piece. I don't know how many of you saw it in the Sunday Times last weekend, in which it was reported that university dons have been turning up in droves to their therapists to try, in absolute despair at the result of Brexit. And they have to see their therapists in extraordinary numbers, far larger numbers than ever before. Ladies and gentlemen, what pathetic, emasculated eunuchs these people must be. What eunuchs, in order to feel, the idea that they feel such terrible fear and pain and resentment at their country becoming free for the first time in 43 years. And what must they be teaching our children as well? It's a nerve-wracking thought. I believe that this vote on the 23rd of June was the most important political moment, most important political event in my lifetime. I believe that it is more important than any general election. It is more important than wars we fought. It is more important than even the great struggles of the 1980s, the struggles that I know many of the former MPs and present MPs in this room took part in. Yes, of course, it was vital that we won the Falklands, that the miners' strike was defeated, that the privatisation took place, and so on. But to place all of those against Brexit, I think actually, ultimately, Brexit is more important, because it is so rare in the history of a nation that the very nature of that nation is shown to the world. And that is what Brexit did, ladies and gentlemen. One of the reasons that the British people voted in the way they did, in such enormous numbers, the largest number, of course, of people ever to vote for anything in the history of the United Kingdom, was because they had a sense of Great Britain having a separate historical development from the rest of Europe. A perfect example comes in 1848. In the February of 1848 and March of 1848, you had a revolution in Paris overthrowing King Louis Philippe. You had, in fact, there was a marvellous moment in that revolution where the mob entered the Tuileries Palace and smashed open the wine in the wine cellars that belonged to the king, and many of them drowned. rather sort of pleasing historical irony, that. But at the same time, in March 1848, in Austria, you had the Chancellor, Metternich, having to escape from Vienna dressed as a washerwoman. You had revolutions in Berlin, in Naples, right the way across. Only two countries didn't have revolutions. The first was Russia, of course, under Tsarism, which was such a tightly controlled state, and the other was Britain. Britain, where already we had passed on the liberties, we had extended them. We had extended the franchise in 1832, and we already had the freedoms that these people in Europe were having their revolution to try to get. Ladies and gentlemen, we do have, thanks to our fabulous 22 miles of salt water. I'm not saying we're better people, I'm not saying we're worse. We are different. Yes. Subtly and naturally and historically different, with a different historical experience and different historical development. And that is something that the 300 historians who wrote that letter to the Times simply cannot accept, even though many of them, most of them, have written books proving that very fact. And so it is something, therefore, that goes to the very heart of what it means to be British, is the instinctive understanding that it is better for our country, and indeed ultimately better for Europe, that we should be self-governing. Yeah. We heard the word patriotism horribly abused in the course of the referendum campaign. Remainers very much got up on their high horses, expounding on their sense of patriotism and how patriotic it was to vote Remain. Ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you the dictionary definition from the Shorter Oxford Dictionary of the term patriotism. Patriotism is to have a zealous demand for your country's rights and freedoms. How on earth can a Remainer claim to have a zealous demand for his country's rights and freedoms when those very rights and freedoms had been given away slice by slice since 1973 as a result of our entering the EEC? Another thing sorry if this is turning into a rant, but no, there's nothing I can do about it, frankly. Another thing that is been infuriating me in recent months is the way in which we have what we did on the 23rd of June has constantly been, especially by organisations like the BBC, tied into a, in my view, completely fictitious, larger analysis, a paradigm which involves Mrs. Le Pen in France and the ghastly Austrian neo-Nazi in Vienna, and the horrors of extreme right ultranationalism in continental Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, that is not who we are. That is not what we are about. That is not why we voted for Brexit. And the way in which the media has attempted again and again, and the left and the Remainers, to paint us as effectively closet racists, is an absolutely infuriating aspect of this thing. Because, ladies and gentlemen, actually, first of all, it is impossible for 17,410,782 people in this country to be racists. It just simply is not the case. And the way in which we have not closed our doors to everybody coming in. In fact, if anything, the rights that we have as a nation to pick and choose who we want to come here and live here is not going to damage the NHS. It's not going to destroy our scientific capacity. It's not going to do any of those things, because we are going to have a system, if it's properly put in place and properly organised, which is another entire question, nonetheless, if it was done properly, we are going to have a system where we have a say over who comes to our country. We control our own borders, and it doesn't mean we're going to close them. It means that we're going to act rationally and intelligently about who we're going to come to have and stay here. And so this is not involved with some wider global right-wing conspiracy. I don't think, actually, by the way, it's got that much to do with Mr. Trump. By the way, Mr. Trump, for all his obvious personal issues, is nonetheless not going to be putting us to the back of the queue when it comes to trade deals in the way that President Obama did. In fact, I was hugely amused that, according to the polls, we were losing by 2% at the time that Mr. Obama landed on Air Force One and came to hector and bully and threaten us. And by the time that the wheels were up and he was flying away from Bryce Norton or wherever it was, we were 2 percentage points ahead. So thank you, Mr. Obama, for doing that. Thank you also to all those big American banks that put hundreds of thousands, indeed ultimately, I suspect, millions of pounds into the Remain side, because it allowed us to show to the nation that, yes, there were these massive international combines on one side, but there was the British people on the other, and it fed into a narrative that we desperately needed to pass on to the British people. So thank you, Goldman Sachs. Thank you, JP Morgan. Thank you, all of these banks. Ladies and gentlemen, as Barry alluded to earlier, this could not have been done without a great coalition. It wasn't any particular party, it wasn't any particular faction or movement or organisation. It was a stunning coming together of people, many of whom didn't like each other. There's no reason to pretend that Aaron Banks and Matthew Elliott are great friends and bosom pals. But what so many people were able to do, not just in this year, but looking back right the way back to 1973, was to keep the flame of resistance alive. Yeah. And that is why I feel so proud to be in this room with so many of the heroes of the Maastricht Rebellion. People, I don't need to name you all, but you know who you are, and so do we. People who were there in the 1990s when the whips came down on them, when their careers were threatened, when their very seats were in danger from the way in which the Whip's office contacted constituency associations. It was a staggering thing that so many people were able, some 26 rebels in the 1992 paving motion debate, were able to do the honourable thing. And when we're looking at this, when historians come to write the story of Brexit, they will go back to 1973. They'll mention Peter Jay and Tony Benn and Enoch Powell and the Taxpayers Alliance and the fantastic Freedom Association that Christopher led for so many years, and the Bruges Group, and so many, the UKIP itself, the whole UKIP phenomenon. All of these groups came together for something that was quite extraordinary, but it could not have happened without Bill Cash and John Redwood and Ian Duncan Smith and these giants. It simply could not have happened. Edmund Burke said that society was effectively a contract between the living, the dead, and those as yet unborn. And it's a fantastic concept that we have the shades of people who we know would have been Brexiteers if they were alive. The Prime Minister that we all love here being a primary example. During the campaign, some people argued that because she'd been in favour of staying in the European Union in 1975, she would somehow have been a Remainer 31 years later. Ladies and gentlemen, I know many of you in this room knew Margaret Thatcher better than I did, but she appointed me to take her place on the Margaret Thatcher Archive Trust. I knew her too. I had conversations with her, like I'm sure so many of us in this room did, and we all know for certain the way that she would have voted on the Brexit. We also know, don't we, the way that Winston Churchill would have voted. Winston Churchill, who, when he gave his great speeches at The Hague and Zurich and these other great speeches in favour of the Council of Europe, in favour of the concept of France and Germany coming together and never going to war together. Again, the two wars that, of course, Winston Churchill remembered of 1914 and 1939 were utterly devastating to his entire generation and his worldview, and it was devastating to the British Empire that he loved. So of course he was going to be in favour of France and Germany coming together. But in each of those speeches, ladies and gentlemen, there are sentences that one can pick out, that one can see, made him completely disassociate himself from the idea of Britain ever becoming itself a member of the European Union. And the way in which the Remainers, the historians and several other people, tried to draw Winston Churchill, of all people, into the Remain side was, I think, deeply ahistorical, and something that, having worked now for nearly 30 years on Winston Churchill, various aspects of Winston Churchill, I can tell you there is absolutely no doubt that he would have been a firm and fantastically eloquent Brexiteer. When we look at the by-election result in Richmond, it's very important that we take the right messages, the correct messages from this, rather than fall into the BBC narrative that it was some kind of national uprising against a hard Brexit. By the way, speaking of the BBC, wasn't it marvellous that literally 2 hours before the Italian vote, it was saying that there was heavy turnout in northern Italy, and therefore it was very likely that Mr. Renzi was going to win. And then 2 hours later, he lost by 60 to 40%. So we can really just set aside the BBC narrative on Richmond. What happened in Richmond took place in the most Remain constituency in the country. It simply does not translate into other parts of the United Kingdom. And when the winner, Sarah Olney, stated that she wanted to have a second referendum, she doesn't seem to be in favour, by the way, of a second vote in her constituency over whether or not she's the best person to have as an MP. But nonetheless, when she states that she would vote against triggering Article 50, after a referendum in which 17,410,782 people, a majority, ladies and gentlemen, said that it wanted to leave the EU. How dare she use the word Democrat in her political assignation? How dare she even breathe the word democracy when she says that she's going to go to Parliament and vote precisely against what the British people have just voted in favour? When it comes to the Supreme Court, I slightly suspect that I'm going to take a different view from most of the rest of the people in this room, in that I so believe in parliamentary democracy that I don't care what the Supreme Court thinks one way or another. I want there to be a vote in Parliament. I want to see every single MP. I want to see all of those Liberals, Sarah Olney and the rest of them. I want to see every Tory who believes that his particular conscience is more important than the will of the British people. I want them out there. I want them counted. I want when the general election comes, I want their constituents to know that they ignored and despised and showed with complete contempt what the British people have voted for this year. In the great panoply, it's all down to colours now. It's not hard or soft Brexit. It's all down to grey, 50 shades of different grey forms of Brexit between the white Brexit and the black Brexit and the rest of it. I prefer the hard and soft. I think it reminds us much more rather like the wets and dries. You know where you are, ladies and gentlemen, don't you, when it comes to the hard and soft Brexit? But it strikes me that that we must give David Davis all of our support, all of our best wishes in these incredibly complicated, incredibly tough, harsh negotiations. But and he seems to be up against a true Anglophobe on the other side. And of course, we're going to try to hope that that Brussels won't actually have the final say in this. That the national governments who want to do business with us, of course they do, are going to be able to put pressure on Brussels for us to get a decent and fair deal. And David should be allowed to get on and negotiate that. But, ladies and gentlemen, if it comes to it, if ultimately we have to go for the ultimate hard Brexit, the World Trade Organization rules, the having Britain treated like America is treated, or any other country from outside the EU is treated, then that is what it must be. And a granite hard Brexit, ladies and gentlemen, this is the last point I want to make, a granite hard Brexit, ladies and gentlemen, is the only thing, I think, ultimately, that will be worthy of a people who this year proved that they were a granite hard people. We've got some time for some questions.
Yeah. Who would like to ask a question? Gentleman in the corner there.
Well, first of all, can I just great speech, and Barry too. Great speech.
Thank you.
What I would say firstly is that why does everybody think a hard Brexit is bad? Because we don't have a free trade deal with America and most of the rest of the world, and that's where we make a surplus. We make a deficit. So all this stuff about we do badly we will do badly if we come out is rubbish. But the question I want to ask you is that the people have one view and the establishment has another. The people are powerful because we have a vote, but the establishment is powerful because they have the levers of power. So what is going to happen? Can we change the view of the establishment?
That's a very interesting question. Well, to take the first question first, I mean, of course, so many companies do business with Europe. So many people. There are, although nationally they make more money out of us than we make out of them. There are many British companies that do make very good profits and employ people as a result of our trade with Europe. So we would not want that to just close down overnight. Of course, it would be cutting off our noses to spite our faces there. But what we should remember is that there are countries lining up to do trade deals with us, free trade deals, especially the Calgacus nations. Calgacus isn't a word that everybody has yet got into their consciousness, but I hope they soon will. It stands for Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and the UK at the end. These four countries, were they able to coalesce in a significant way with free trade, and I believe also free movement of peoples would be great between those countries, you would have a nation, effectively a federation, that would be the third richest country in the world in terms of GDP and second richest in terms of GDP per capita. You would have a tremendously powerful military nation. You would have the largest, by far the largest country in the world as well. We should not be turning our back like we did in 1973 on the people who have the same laws as us, the same attitudes as us, the same language as us, the same Queen. This is going to be, I hope, Brexit is going to be the first stage towards a federation of the Calgacus countries. Now, your second question is about whether or not the establishments are the sort of ruling cliques of the nation are so badly tainted with defeatism and pro-EU feeling that it's just impossible to do anything about it. Ladies and gentlemen, there was an Italian philosopher called Antonio Gramsci, a man of the hard left, who in the 1920s and 30s wrote books about how important it was for the left to capture the commanding heights of society, not necessarily to win elections and votes, but to change minds, having taken over universities, for example. Now, of course, TV stations are very much part of this process, and newspapers and so on. The commanding heights of the sort of chatterati it has been entirely lost to the Leave camp. And the answer is whether or not it can be. It will take years. Many years, because most of these people are actually ensconced in tremendously powerful positions in Britain. But the way to do it is through the ballot box. The way to do it is to have young people stand for election who are not infected by this sense of defeatism, but actually will be able to use the political power that still resides in Parliament, and indeed under Brexit will reside more than ever in Parliament, in order to try to alter the nation. It'll take years, but it can be done.
Thank you. I'll take a question from Christopher. Christopher, go.
Andrew, I would like to pose the question, what is there to negotiate? Why couldn't we simply go over there and say to those people in Brussels, we're out. Don't you understand? We've just had a referendum. We've all voted to leave the European Union. But if you guys want to have the same trade arrangements with us in the future, the decision is yours. We are terribly at fault in having put ourselves in the position of supplicant when we don't need to be supplicant.
I hope there wasn't a question there, because there's no there's not one that I need to answer, Chris.
Tim Conlon for the next question.
Can I just second up that, really? That it was a wonderful speech, by the way, fantastic. That on this, the question is really comes down to is trade, really, what it's all about. And can I just say that, you know, wonderful perspective, historical perspective, and so on. Churchill, a great free trader. We don't need to have 2 years of negotiation. No. We just say, repeal the 72 Act. Yes. Look, we have no trade barriers. We go back to where we were before 1932. You're a historian, you know, input needed by the council and so on. We go back to that. If you guys want to impose your 4% common external tariff on Britain, well, go on with you silly. Yeah. And, you know, you've really got free trade with Canada and Mexico. You know, so when you're like, well, okay, life will go on. Bye-bye. Yeah. We don't need to go through 2 years of negotiation. We just need to repeal the 72 Act. Can I please beg you, Andrew, to write an article in favour of unilateral free trade, and we don't, also on the other point, we don't need to do these special trade deals. That's the point that I know that we don't, we just say, we leave you, we just have free trade, we like Singapore, we flourish like Singapore, Hong Kong, like our former colonies, we can do fine in the world.
Can I say that in that list of organisations and individuals who kept the dream alive for so many years, I was very remiss in not mentioning the economists. Tim Congdon being right up there with the late Ken Minogue. I think Patrick Minford, one would say, would also be one of these people. Sorry? Roger Bootle. I didn't see that Roger was here. You know, we have in this room more economic brains than you get in most treasuries. And sorry, Roger, for having shamelessly plagiarised so many of your articles over the last few years.
Right, I'll take a question from Emma. Yes.
Thank you very much. Andrew, what is the situation on the various agreements that surround us, also slightly larger ones, with the EEA? I'm unclear as to whether in fact they are binding as we leave the EU, or whether in fact it will all unravel at the same time.
Do you know, this is really one for Bill. Bill knows the answers to that, to these issues much better than I do.
Shall I say something?
Yes.
Very simply, Emma, very simply, it's just that we are members of the EEA by virtue of being in the EU, and therefore leaving the EU will have a knock-on effect regarding the EEA. We do not want to be trapped, in my opinion. I'm not an economist, but I don't want to be trapped into the kind of rules and regulations which were imposed upon us under the EEA. Through the Court of Justice, not good news.
I'll take a question from the gentleman here.
I'm wondering if we're
losing our even-handedness, especially in the light of the information. And I wonder if this can be corrected through the action of Brexit. Hearing that a group of, I think it's 6 bishops from ISIS countries beset by ISIS, have been refused entry into Great Britain, even though they've been invited by His Royal Highness Prince Charles, while at the same time the British government is welcoming avowed terrorists into the country without any restriction. Are we losing our even-handedness? Can this be corrected?
I'm afraid I don't know anything about. I haven't read anything about this. This seems an absolutely outrageous thing to have happen. Not least because the government should have extremely good reasons for going against what Prince Charles thinks is acceptable. Prince Charles is a public servant of over half a century, and therefore an awful lot more than most government ministers, and we should be listening to him, it strikes me. But nonetheless, I'm afraid I don't have any expertise in this. I don't know who the bishops are.
Thank you. I'll take a further question from the gentleman there. Yes, you, sir.
Andrew, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much for your help with some press releases we did with Veterans for Britain during the campaign about Churchill, which was very well received by the media. My question is just on the historical context. How easy is it to find historical precedent for countries that have the shackles of protectionism removed and all of a sudden they are free to do much better?
Well, again, to try and answer that in the same room as Roger Booth and Tim is nerve-wracking. But I seem to remember, was there not a South American combine in the 1880s or 1890s that came together, created a single currency that later broke up with massive ill-temporal round. Now, obviously, we haven't gone so far into the single currency, thankfully. But as far as historical precedence is concerned, that's the one that I seem to remember. I have written about this, but it was about 10 years ago, and I can't remember even which countries were involved in it. But can I also use this opportunity to congratulate you on everything you did for Veterans for Britain? It was a fantastic documentation.
Okay, I'm going to take a final question from that gentleman by the door.
It's a question to you as a historian. It's a political question as well. About a third of, roughly speaking, a large number of Conservatives actually voted for the Remain side. The vote was actually won because a substantial number of Labour voters voted for the Leave side, what you would call the classic patriotic Labour vote. Historically,
and 4 million UKIP.
Yes, I'm not forgetting the UKIP at all. I'm saying that there's substantial numbers of Labour voters.
Yeah.
Thinking about the future and building a coalition of people who will defend national sovereignty, regardless of what you do with that national sovereignty later, which may go in a Bruges group direction or in another direction. What do you think are the historical, if you like, precedents of binding those people together into one national sovereignty coalition to defend not only the process of Brexit, but afterwards any attempts to roll it back?
Yes. Well, of course, it is absolutely fascinating to look at the collective mental breakdown of the Labour Party at the moment. I mean, what they're going through is cataclysmic. For the Labour Party to have lost their deposit in Richmond shows what is going on. The fact that they have re-elected a Marxist-Leninist as their leader, meaning that this man is going to continue to be their leader into a general election, is going to try to persuade the British people that the man who should be Prime Minister is a man who in the past has supported the IRA and called Hamas his friends, must be, and indeed is, leading to this massive collective coronary on the part of the Labour Party. But what we should see is the opportunity that has been seen a very few times in history of the tectonic plates of British politics shifting perceptibly, shifting in front of our very eyes. And Brexit was, as you say, the key moment for that. If you're looking for precedents, I would go back to the Corn Laws, also a great issue of free trade, which crushed the Conservative Party and left them out of power, out of majority power for 28 years in the mid-19th century. Then the great battle over Irish Home Rule, which split the Liberal Party, destroyed Gladstonian liberalism, and allowed the Conservatives to rule for 18 of the next 20 years. And then after that, you have to look to the national governments of the 1920s and 1930s. That is the kind of thing that is going on here. And for people still to cling to the old concepts is, it seems to me, a historic mistake. What is happening is, as you say, the possibility for a patriotic alliance that goes beyond party, above party, and unfortunately, I can see it just going away if mistakes are made over Brexit. And of course, in our first past the post system, it's tremendously difficult to actually make the plates move. But they seem to be moving very much, and it's up for grabs what happens at the next election. It strikes me that Mrs. May, if for any inconceivable reason the House of Commons did not vote to trigger Article 50, would have a perfect opportunity of having Parliament and peers and judges versus the people election. And if that happened, ladies and gentlemen, you really would see one of the great landslides like 1906 or 1945. That's right. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed.
Andrew, thank you so much for that speech and also for dealing with those questions. Now, I'm actually going to ask Bill Cash to formally propose a vote of thanks to you.
Well, Andrew, thank you. I mean, we are truly privileged, and it's a unique opportunity to hear a really great historian putting all these huge matters, this great historical landscape into perspective. Andrew, you really are a remarkable analyst, but you have also written some remarkable books. And one book that has not been mentioned so far is The Storm of War, which I think most people, certainly, if I may say, in the historical world, would regard as perhaps your greatest book, 2 volumes, I believe. But in addition to that, of course, there was Salisbury, and we've heard the Holy Box and Halifax, but it's terrific stuff. But to actually hear somebody who sees history through the lens, through the prism of these great events, and right at the end you summarised it so beautifully, because actually the truth is that the who governs Britain question, the how we trade question, the freedom question, the freedom of choice in the marketplace for trade, the freedom of choice in the ballot box, are the defining features of this great debate about the EU. And you have put it to the audience in a way that nobody else, in my knowledge, could possibly do, because you both understand it politically, but you also can see it in that historical context, which makes it so uniquely enjoyable and fascinating and instructive. I want to just make one small reference to this Arkan Memorandum book, which you might be a bit surprised. I think he's a bit embarrassed about it, but he shouldn't be, because it's a damn good read. And by the way, I think that you may be able to buy it on eBay or something or other. But I tell you this, if you can, I think it's a wonderful book. And I'm going to tell you why, because there's somebody just outside there, if she hasn't gone already, called Biddy Cash. And in this Arkan Memorandum, I have to tell you this, and forgive me for being so personal about it, but you see, as Barry said, the referendum, the Arkan referendum, takes place, I think it's on the 4th of May 2015. Well, that's remarkable in itself, so to get that right. But in addition to that, the archives are only discovered as a result of a murder, and there's this chap called Peter Riley. He knows what I'm talking about, knows where I'm going. And Peter Riley has these documents, and he's trying to find out how it all happened. Right, who done it? Well, actually, he then says that he got to talk to Biddy Cash. It's in the book, Biddy Cash, that venerable octogenarian and widow, I have to say, of Bill Cash, who led the Maastricht Rebellion. Now, I'm going to say this very simply. I'm still around. It really would be incomplete without paying a fantastic tribute to all my friends here in this room. And also, if I may say, Andrew, it was so good of you to refer to that Maastricht Rebellion for this reason. I see Ivan there. I'm not going to go to... And Michael Lord, Framlingham as he's called now, and and Christopher. And there are so many, I'm not picking them all out. Roger and Walter Sweeney and so on. What I want to say is this. You were so right. It was really tough in those days, and we really did do it, but a historian understands it in a way that perhaps the commentators and some of what I'm now going to describe as the mediocrities don't. They don't understand. For them, it's just a story. For us, and for those who are involved in these things, it is the most enormous tension. It is really difficult. I saw people in tears. And therefore, what you said is very deeply appreciated. And finally, can I just simply say this, that you are so right, too, about Churchill. He's been misused so much, so often, and you are writing a book. You didn't mention it. You were modest, I think, in not mentioning it, but I think all I can say is I'm looking forward to it, as I have all your other books. But this book is going to be one of the really great histories. Your Napoleon is really great. All the others too, but this one I think is going to surpass them all. Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. It's been an enormous pleasure. Could I ask you to give a really big round of applause?
We've not quite finished yet. I just want to pay a small tribute to my former colleague, Bill Cash. And I want to give him a momentum which relates to that period 24 years ago when we were defying the government and trying to maintain the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. It was an historic time, and I've chosen this book for you. It's a book called Troublesome Young Men. It's about the MPs that actually opposed appeasement in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And when you read that book, Bill, you will see that 50 years isn't a very long time. That the tactics that were used against us were used against Churchill, were used against Eden, Amory, and all those people. The same tactics. Most of the MPs that fought against appeasement throughout the 1930s decided on the vote on the Munich Agreement to actually abstain. And they did that because they thought that Chamberlain might call a general election and he may move to deselect them. And I think that will ring a bell with many of my colleagues from 1992 to 95, because that wasn't a novel idea that John Major came up with. It was a one from 50 years before. Now, one other thing about this book, the central character in it is not Churchill or Eden. The central character is MP called Roland Cartland. Now, many of you will probably never have heard of Roland Cartland. He was elected in 1935 for the King's Norton Division, and he consistently opposed appeasement. When war was declared, he enlisted. And then he returned to vote against the government in the Norway debate. He voted against the government in the Norway debate, and he received the usual abuse from the Tory whips. And again, we know all about that. But Cartland then returned to join his men in France, and within a matter of weeks, he was killed on the retreat to Dunkirk. He made the ultimate sacrifice. Now, this book covers in detail the events also in the days leading up to your birth, Bill, on the 10th of May, 1940. 3 days before you were born, we had the Norway debate.
That is true.
Yeah, the Norway debate. And then, on the Friday, the day before you were born, Hitler invaded the Low Countries. And then the day Bill was born, Churchill became Prime Minister. Now, with those great events happening, I'm sure that Bill got some knowledge of it and knew that he had to be born and couldn't miss any more. Bill, well done for everything you've done.
Thank you very much.